You were 8 years old, sitting at the back or in the middle or right up the front, and the teacher asked a question. You knew the answer. You had the whole sentence composed in your head, word for word. And still, your hand did not go up. Not because you were lazy, not because you did not care, but because somewhere, silently, your nervous system had already run the numbers, and the cost of speaking felt higher than the cost of being invisible. There is an entire population of people who spent their school years like that. And according to developmental psychology, what those kids grew up to become is one of the quietly interesting stories in personality research. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is not a pep talk about introverts. It is the reason a certain kind of adult still, 20 years later, hesitates to speak in a room full of peers. Let us start with what was actually happening inside those kids' heads. Psychologists have a word for kids like this. They call them behaviorally inhibited. The landmark research came from the Harvard psychologist Jerome Kagan, who began tracking children in the 1980s and followed them into adulthood. What he found was striking. About 15 to 20% of children are born with a highly reactive nervous system. Novel situations, loud noises, unfamiliar people all produce stronger physiological responses in them, faster heart rates, more cortisol, quicker startle. And critically, Kagan showed that this reactivity is visible as early as 4 months old. It is not shyness, which is learned. It is temperament, which is constitutional. A quiet kid in class is not a slow kid. They are not a lazy kid. They are a kid whose threat detection system is, on average, running at a higher default. Their silence is not absence, it is calibration, translation. Those kids were not failing to participate. They were doing more invisible work per second than the kid who raised their hand without thinking. But here's where it gets interesting, because the quiet was never the whole story. You know that feeling when someone asks a question and you can feel at least 3 answers forming at once, each with caveats, each with exceptions, each with a worry about how it might land? That is what was happening under the silence. In research on sensory processing sensitivity, published across the 1990s by the psychologists Elaine Aron and Arthur Aron in journals, including the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, they documented something close to this. About 20% of people process incoming information more deeply than the average, noticing subtleties, running more associations, considering more angles before reacting, same input, completely different output. The quiet kid was not behind the conversation. They were ahead of it. By the time they had composed a full reply, the classroom had already moved on. Notice the pattern. Teachers often read this as disengagement. The kid themselves often read it as slowness. Neither was true. They were just running a higher resolution version of the same classroom, one that takes longer to render. Now, where it might get a little uncomfortable, because it is more personal than most people want to admit. A significant portion of these kids learned something about themselves by 10 that they are still carrying at 30. Being quiet is read by the culture around you as a problem to be solved. Well-meaning adults ask, "Why are you so quiet?" Classmates ask, "Why are you so quiet?" Bosses, decades later, ask, "Why are you so quiet?" And the question itself is a small injury, because it reframes your whole operating system as a deficit. While the rest of the room is just existing, these people are internally narrating. Do I seem weird right now? Should I say something just to balance the air? Did they notice that I have not spoken in 10 minutes? Will they think I'm judging them? The present moment enters briefly, and the internal monologue bulldozes right over it. Psychologists sometimes call this self-monitoring, and chronic high self-monitors burn more cognitive fuel in social settings than others. It is exhausting precisely because nothing visible is happening. If that is you, here is the reframe. You do not have a participation problem. You have a translation problem. Those are very different things. You are not failing to produce words. You are producing too many to pick from. And let us talk about where this actually comes from, because it is bigger than any one classroom. You can see exactly where it comes from. Western classrooms, and later Western workplaces, are not neutral. They are structured around what the writer Susan Cain, in her 2012 book Quiet, called the extrovert ideal. The quiet cultural belief that confident, talkative, fast-to-speak people are more competent, more leadership material, more of an asset. Decades of research in organizational psychology have complicated this story. In a 2011 paper in the Academy of Management Journal, Adam Grant, Francesca Gino, and David Hoffman showed that quieter leaders in teams with proactive employees actually outperform their more vocal counterparts because they listen more, ask better questions, and leave room for other people's ideas to land. but the bias runs deep. By grade 3, many quiet kids have already internalized the message: speak fast or be overlooked. Years of small reinforcements. Later, they are still flinching in meetings at 29. The school was never neutral. The silence was just the cost of being the wrong temperament in the wrong room. And there is one more thing worth naming, because the timing of it tends to matter a lot. Quiet kids often bloom late, not because they are slow, because the rooms they find themselves in for the first 25 years of their lives are structurally biased toward fast verbal performance. School rewards it. Early career jobs reward it. Dating scenes reward it. By the time the quiet kid reaches their early 30s, a subtle shift begins. The rooms change. Expertise starts to matter more than pace. Judgment starts to matter more than speed. Depth starts to be visible to other adults in a way it was never visible to classrooms of 8-year-olds. Research on career development, including longitudinal work on what psychologists call conscientiousness and deliberate practice, has repeatedly shown that the skills that compound slowly, attention, patience, careful reading of people, willingness to sit with complexity, begin to pay their largest dividends somewhere between 35 and 50. The writer David Epstein, in his 2019 book Range, compiled a striking amount of evidence for this. Across medicine, science, art, business, and sport, late specializers who had appeared ordinary for decades often overtook early specializers who had once seemed destined. The quiet kid is, in many cases, a late specializer in disguise. They were not underperforming. They were running a slower, deeper, more expensive developmental track, one that, because it does not produce visible wins early, gets quietly mislabeled as underachievement. If you are a quiet kid still in your 20s and feeling behind, this is worth sitting with. The people whose pace most resembles yours often peak in their 40s. The scoreboard you have been using is not just unfair, it is also timed wrong. There is a weird paradox at the core of the quiet kid story. The people who are quiet in class often grow up to be some of the most observant, thoughtful, richly interior adults in the room. They notice what was not said. They remember the subtext. They ask the question no one else wanted to ask. They often become the writers, the researchers, the therapists, the engineers, the second in commands who quietly make the whole team function. Look at any field that rewards deep focus and careful thinking, and you will find a striking overrepresentation of people who, at 9 years old, were told they needed to come out of their shell. Most of them did not need to come out of anything. They needed a room that could hear them at their natural volume, and yet they still, reflexively, feel behind the conversation, because the scoreboard they learned in 3rd grade measured volume, not depth. This is not a flaw in the mind. It is just a particular architecture, one that is frankly better suited to observation than to performance, to synthesis than to speed, to the long draft than to the quick answer. So what does all this actually mean? If you were the quiet kid and some part of you still apologizes for it, you do not need to. You were not slow. You were not stuck. You were thinking in full sentences while the room was still in fragments. Your nervous system was tuned for depth, and depth in a fast room looks like absence. The next time someone asks why you are so quiet and you catch yourself apologizing, remember, you were never avoiding the conversation. You were just running a longer, more careful version of it in a room that had already moved on. The silence was never the story. It was only ever the surface of it. If this resonated with you, please subscribe. And if you want to support these deep dives, consider hitting that join button to become a channel member. I would genuinely appreciate it.